Thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion on the power of story to inspire change. My name is Lisa Gerber, and I'm the Director of Strategy for Their Story is Our Story. In the October issue of Time magazine, Jane Goodall was interviewed about her lifetime of work in activism and environmentalism. And she said that if you can get into the minds of people with a story, you may not know it at the time, but they will go on thinking. And I thought that was a beautiful quote, and I wanted to share that this morning to get started because I feel like it sets a really beautiful context for our discussion today. Before we do get started, I have just a few housekeeping items. First of all, this session is being recorded and it will be shared by Their Story is Our Story and Ron Bourke Films. Your attendance here accepts that, and if you prefer not to be recorded, then you're welcome to leave the meeting and watch this as a recording afterwards, but we hope that you'll stay with us. Your lines have been muted as you entered today. We just ask that you keep your line muted unless you're speaking or asking a question, and we do encourage your questions, so we will be opening it up shortly for those questions. We have some that have been submitted in advance, and so we'll be starting with those, and then we'll ask you, and do whatever's comfortable for you. Put them in the chat. We have a really small group today, so feel free to unmute, and if you feel comfortable, turn on your video and let's have an interactive, lovely discussion. So this past Sunday was World Storytelling Day, and on that day we kicked off a partnership for a week-long free online streaming of 2 films produced by Ron Bourke. The first one is Terror and Hope, The Science of Resilience, and the second is Lessons of Basketball and War. Both films tell a powerful story about child refugees. You know, I was shocked to read this, but according to UNICEF, nearly a quarter of the world's children live in conflict or disaster-stricken countries, including the millions now fleeing the tragic war in Ukraine. So these stories are more timely now than ever. Sadly, we could say that every month it feels like there's something new to be concerned about, unfortunately. So if you haven't watched these films yet, we encourage you to do so. Share them with your friends and family. They're available through this Saturday, March 26th. And we're going to drop a link into the chat for you to get those if you haven't had those before. So Their Story is Our Story is very proud to partner with Ron Bourke. We're very happy to have him here today. We both share a passion and mission for sharing the stories of the refugee experience to inspire greater understanding and more welcoming communities. So let's get started with an introduction from each of our panelists. I'd like to ask each of you for just a couple of minutes about who you are, your background, and then we'll get into the questions. So we have today Ron Bourke, the filmmaker. We have Trisha Limer, a TSOS Associate Director. We have Liz Sheptek-Shumlai. I hope I did that close. Liz, you'll have to correct me. And Heather Oman. So Ron, let's start with you. If you could introduce yourself, tell us who you are, a little bit about your background.
Well, it's a long story. I'll keep it short. I'm an independent filmmaker. I have been making commercial films for many years, actually decades, and it got to a point where I really wanted to do something that had more meaning for me. So I was involved with my first refugee film, Lessons of Basketball and War. I quit my corporate job and I'm devoting my full time to this effort. It's something I feel is very important, I think, for the world and certainly for myself to spend the time and effort and money involved in doing it. My second film, Lessons of Basketball, Terror and Hope, The Science of Resilience, followed up on that experience. Again, it sort of comes from a curiosity as far as other people, other cultures. I'm very privileged in my life, and I probably feel a bit of guilt because of that, and especially with what's going on in the world right now. And I'm sort of trying to use my craft to hopefully make at least a little bit of difference in the world.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Thank you, Ron. Trisha.
Yes, my name is Trisha Leimer. I'm married for 32 years. I've been married. My husband's in Germany, or is from Germany. And in 2000, we moved to Germany and raised our 5 children there. And in 2015, we had, Germany was celebrating their 25 years of reunification, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in that same, like a month later, millions of refugees came flooding in across her border. And my daughter's high school gym was turned into an emergency reception center. I started volunteering there and in some other camps around Frankfurt. And then in 2016, I traveled home, and it was an election year, and I was shocked at the rhetoric, the fear rhetoric that I was hearing from people that I loved and respect. And I realized I understood it because I realized that there hadn't been a whole lot of personal experience for most of us with Middle Easterns, except maybe the terrible events of September 11th in 2002. And I found myself wishing that I could bring these people that I was meeting in the camps together with the people that I love in the US, and that wasn't possible. And I would go back and I would go into the camps. I'd bring scarves and knitting needles from the community, and I would take pictures of these people, bring them into the camps and show the refugees, oh, there are people that love you. And then I would take pictures of them with the things they've made or done with the things that were given to them and take them back to the community. And I saw this amazing connection taking place. And I thought, maybe that's how we can combat this misconception and these fears, is by allowing the refugees to tell their stories and to use photographs. And that was kind of the genesis of TSOS. And that's been what I've been doing ever since, is working with TSOS and sharing stories and gathering stories.
Beautiful, thank you. Liz, and can you also correct me on your name pronunciation?
No, you did a great job.
Really?
I have heard a lot of different interpretations of my name.
I'm sure you have.
This is great.
I'm sure.
So my name is Liz, or Elizabeta Jeftic Shomley. And I come originally from Yugoslavia / Serbia and Montenegro / Serbia. I have a refugee background and gypsy background. An interesting story in itself, I guess. I have, as a child refugee myself, I have been very interested and intrigued in the psychology that comes with that label, right? And how children deal with it. I have looked at my peers and myself, my brother, my family. And so I've dedicated myself to the study of that. So I have studied Holocaust, and I hold PhD in international conflict analysis, with specifically looking into the children's rights and looking into integration and reintegration of children back into the society. And so for that reason, I'm super excited to be here and to participate and to hear more about Ron's experiences with this. And I currently am with TSOS volunteering as associate director. And I've been with TSOS for 2 years because I, like Trisha, feel that the individual story has that power to change the perception and to connect people on a human basis. And as someone who studied politics and social sciences, I know that facts and statistics are great, but they do not give the feeling, the emotion that's necessary for human beings to actually be human beings. And that's what makes us different. And that's something like one of the things that was said in the movie, the compassion, the ability to have compassion is what makes us human beings. And I just love that. And I think that's what we are trying to achieve with TSOS.
Wonderful. And Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather. I've been with TSOS for about 3 years, and I've come to it in kind of a circuitous route. I've always been interested in writing and language. I am by trade, by profession, a speech language pathologist, but I had been working with an online literary magazine for about 12 years, and the people that were working with that magazine, it was called Segula, kind of crossed over with TSOS. So I was brought in initially just, I was told to do some light editing on some stories here and there as my schedule allowed. But one of the things we had done in our literary magazine is tell the stories about women. And so this was, I felt kind of right up my alley. I love what we've been talking about, how a story is a way that you can get inside somebody's experience and really understand what it feels like, what it looks like. So I started light editing of stories, and it has snowballed into now I'm the director of story production. Thrilled,
just like that.
thrilled to be a part of it, and excited to see where this organization goes from here, and loved the movies. Thank you so much for sharing them with us, Ron. That was some excellent storytelling too.
That's great. And, I just want to underscore what you all have just said. I came to their story as our story. I work with nonprofits to help them with their storytelling, and I've always cared very deeply about the refugee situation, Jewish, and learning about the Holocaust at a very young age. It really just got deep into me as just a terrifying thing for children and families. And when I learned of their story as our story, and the ability, like you said, Ron, like there's an amount of guilt, and how can I help and what can I do? Well, I've found a way where I can use my storytelling and strategy skills to contribute to that. So I feel like we all have really unique stories how we come to this. Let's get into the questions. What I would love to do is I have one question for each of you, and then while you're listening, those of you who are attending, thank you for joining us. And now that you've heard who's on the panel, a little bit of their backgrounds, please, if you have any questions for them, go ahead and put them in the chat. Although we do have plenty of questions to go through as well. So, Ron, I'd like to start by asking you, what inspired you to produce these films on the refugee experience?
Boy, I think it's a curiosity more than anything else. My first refugee film, well, actually, I have in my corporate background, I did a lot of traveling, and I worked in third world countries like poverty areas in India and that sort of thing on corporately sponsored projects. But doing a personal project, I think the thing that got me is I was seeing in the Portland, Oregon area where I live, young people, young girls and boys, and especially girls with hijabs, dark skinned. I had no idea who they were, where they were from. And there was a real curiosity as far as wanting to know more about them and their lives and what they were doing in our community. So I did a little investigation, and I discovered the program at a middle school here in Portland, where there was a small group of Somali refugees that were basically dropped into a middle school, very little English. They had come from camps in Kenya, and they were having a lot of problems in the school with the violence, mostly among the girls fighting each other. So I thought that was very interesting. I wanted to know more. I wanted to talk to the principal. After a little bit of arm twisting and showing him my past work, he agreed to let us bring cameras into the school. And that's where it sort of all started, is with that film and learning about these young girls that were all of a sudden dropped into our culture, a culture very different than the refugee camps where most of them were born. With Beyonce and hip hop music and the sexuality, and they were enthralled with all of it. Their parents, not so much. So it sort of went from there.
Yeah, one of the things that really impressed me, I mean, there was so much in the movie about these girls, and I do just have to say that at the end, when I believe it was one of the teachers who said, after they got involved in the basketball, that the Somalis. They aren't the refugees anymore. They are Habiba. They are Fatuma. They
Yeah.
are, their actual names. It really, and how the story just really changes, which is exactly what we're here talking about today.
Yeah, I think that's for me what made it all worthwhile, because I had the exact same experience. I was very surprised that after maybe the first day or day and a half of filming, and we did it over several months, but even after a day or so, they stopped either being shy and not wanting to be photographed, or some of them mugging for the camera and making funny faces. And all of a sudden, I became invisible. I just became that old dude with the camera, and which was wonderful. And to me, they were Asha and Habiba, and they became basically friends, which was just
Yeah.
wonderful. And I think that's
Yeah.
why I do what I do. And I think TSOS, that's your mission statement too, is to create familiarity, because they're not the other. They are like us. They may not seem
Exactly.
at first like us, but from many different cultures, children are children. Parents want for their kids what we want for our kids. And I think if I accomplish nothing else, that's what I'd like to accomplish with my filmmaking, is to increase
Yeah.
that familiarity, and maybe that can make us a more welcoming country.
Yeah, it really breaks down the barriers. And I actually want to go to Liz from here, because sort of on that note, as a refugee yourself, Liz, what do you wish people would have been more interested in learning about your journey? And I don't want to lead you, but I guess I was thinking about this piece about the after. I again, you said something to me in an earlier conversation, that once you escape the persecution and the violence, people assume that that's everything's okay and you're in a safe place, and that's not the case at all.
Well, I think I think both of the movies actually show that very, very vividly, right?
Yeah,
In the Terror and Hope, you have all of these children, and there's all this research that goes on, and even the people that are doing the research, they're all stating it. They're all talking like, there's one child that comes and says, my brain just doesn't work the same way. I just cannot retain all this information. I know we just did this in school yesterday, but I just, because my brain is in a completely different place. And that's one. And even with the lessons of basketball and war, you see these girls, and as they progress and as they're being interviewed and they talk about this, and you can see the conflict, the issues. There's still so many. There's stigmas. There are things that need to deal with as a teenage girl alone. It's so hard to be a teenage girl in these days. There's so many things that are handling on you, and then on top of that, you have the cultural issues. Then you have the issues of, are you being accepted by your community or not? And I think, I was a teenage refugee as well, and I had to learn the language. And I remember another refugee friend saying to me, one day I came to school and I was really down, because I was missing my mom, who died during our escape. And there was just a lot of loss, and I was just trying to figure out the world. We've been there only for maybe 6 months at this point. And so it was really hard. And I just had a down day. And she came up to me and she said, what's wrong? What's going on? And I said, I'm just really sad. I miss my mom. I miss my family. I miss my friends. I miss my home. I miss everything. And she said to me something, and it stuck with me forever. And I kept debating between, is it right or is it wrong? And she said, well, lock those feelings away. Don't share these things. Don't talk about these things, because people will use it and exploit it. They will not understand what you're talking about. So sort of buckle up, toughen up, and just move on. And I think, it was important to know that, and to work that way. But it's also really hard to have to be in that flight and fight status all of your life.
mm-hmm.
And as a
Mm-hmm.
child, when you're trying to figure out all of these things, well, why do they hate me so much? What did I ever do to them? And, so I wish people would have approached me as Liz, and, asked about my home, asked about my family, asked about my dreams. What do I want to be when I grow up? Right? That would have been, I wish people would have been a little bit maybe more respectful about the fact that, oh yes, I have a gypsy background, and oh yes, I come from Serbia, but oh yes, I am a good student, and I do speak multiple languages, and I do want to learn. It was sort of a, from teacher to the principal, everyone was so shocked by this, as if refugee has to be this certain boxed type of a person, and it's usually always on the lowest of the denominators of everything, and that's not the case. So I wish people would have been more interested in me as a person and in my family, in loss that I've experienced, in stresses that I'm enduring, and more interested in helping me build a future, accepting me and helping me to understand how to navigate a new culture, and be more welcoming of the fact that I am trying to learn your language. I am trying to acclimatize myself to this, but I don't want to lose who I am and where I come from, because I am proud of my heritage, and please let me be proud of my heritage. So I'll stop there. If you want to ask more, you can ask.
Well, I would just love if anyone here, either the panelists or those listening in, if anyone has anything you'd like to, if that brings up anything for you, any insights you'd like to share.
I know, as I've sat with some of my friends who were fresh from that journey, and some of them were 14, 16, 17, and I've watched them over the last 5 years. They've when I sat down and listened to them and wanted to hear their story, I was surprised that they hadn't really talked about what they'd been through, even with their family, even with the people that they're close to, because you just don't do that. You suck it up, like Liz is saying. And I was really cautious with coming to them and asking them. And when they told me they wanted to, I felt like they were giving me something very precious. And I was so honored to be able to sit there and with a camera even and record those. And without fail, they would stand up, my friends, each one would stand up in that personal setting, and they would just take a deep breath after they told their story and just say, it feels so good to be listened to. It feels so good to have somebody want to hear and to be heard.
Which is a really important piece of this, because we often think that the story is for the benefit of those who are listening, and it is equally to the benefit of those who are telling. Thanks.
I might add to that, on Terror and Hope, when we were talking with some of the mothers who had gone through just horrendous violence, escaping from Syria with their families. I think everyone that we talked to had lost their husbands in the war. And after we were done with one of the interviews, the cameras were packed up and we're on our way out. And we asked one of the moms, why did you agree to do this and allow us to bring our cameras in and hear your story? And she said, the world needs to know. The world needs to know what we've been through. And I think that's really important, that people want to tell their story, and they're not often given the voice to be able to do that.
Yeah. Heather, what is the greatest challenge in gathering these stories, especially these very raw feelings in interviews?
I think the greatest challenge for me is making sure that I maintain the person's voice. And I think in some ways it's almost like a sacred trust that we have somebody who comes in and does an interview, and then we have to take this raw transcript and turn it into something that's readable, something that is, editable, something that is consumable. And I always try to make sure that we maintain the person's voice, and that I tell the story, or that our team tells the story in the way that the person really wants to be seen. And I usually I'm not the one who is gathering the story, but I try to work with the person who did gather the story and say, what was the thing that stood out while you were talking? What is the thing that the refugee was talking about the most? We recently did a story about a gentleman who came from Nigeria, and the interviewer said, "Oh, make sure that we have a lot of footage about or a focus on how he got a job where he could finally wear a suit." And that was just really important to him. And that didn't come through the interview exactly, but it came through when they were sitting down together, that wearing a suit and being presentable, finally having a job where, he felt like he could present himself in the way he wanted to present it was really, really important to him. And that's not necessarily something that I would have pulled out in the story just from the raw materials that I got. So that's always the hardest part. And also, I think one of the most important things too is making sure that we do the best that we can in telling the story in the way that the refugee wants to be seen.
Yeah.
And trying not to add my own bias or my team's bias onto, what we think it should sound like.
Important. Let's see, I have some audience submitted questions, and I can read those out loud. Candace, I might look to you for some guidance here. Is, do you know if
on? Yeah, so Patty, you want to ask your question?
Patty, beautiful.
Well, my questions were just a little bit different. I watched with my daughter who's going into occupational therapy. And so she kind of looked at it from an occupational therapist point of view. She wanted to know about the study, which I see is now posted there. But the other question is, were occupational therapists involved with the Syrian study, and how were they involved?
And
Not
Ron,
to my knowledge. Oh.
Ron, can you just provide a little bit of context for anyone who might not have seen
Okay.
the film?
Okay. The Terror and Hope follows a small group of researchers who are studying the impact of toxic stress and trauma on children who are war refugees. And they're working with the humanitarian group Mercy Corps, which was working in the camps in Jordan, working with the kids. And the main goal of the study was to determine how successful the interventions that Mercy Corps was doing in regards to stress and trauma, how effective they were, and what could be done to improve the work that they're doing. And the study gets a little involved with what was involved with the study, but as far as I know, I don't know of Mercy Corps working with any occupational therapists. My main focus was on the research itself, as far as how successful it was and whether things needed to be done to increase the effectiveness. And basically the impact of stress and trauma on children who have lived through war or violence. So I really don't know about the occupational therapy, but I've just posted the study itself, the published study, which should answer that as best you can. And or perhaps through Mercy Corps. I know a lot of their programs are developed in country. They believe very strongly that people from the same culture should be involved with any remediation efforts and helping the victims of war and violence. So a lot of it is developed locally in Jordan for at least the case of the Syrian refugees. So sorry, I don't know more about that.
Thank you for what you did tell me. She's just really excited to work with refugees as well through this new career. So thanks.
Yeah. Good luck to her.
Thanks.
That's wonderful.
Can I piggyback on that? So, I mean, right with the research that I have done, I have noticed a lot of times, this is what Ron is saying, right? A lot of times you work with the resources that are available on the ground. right? And not every place will have the same level of expertise. And on top of that, you also have the trust issue. So even if you had, someone brought in from outside, the question is whether people will feel comfortable to talk to this person because they're considered a stranger, right? And so you have to consider that what a lot of these local NGOs and grassroots will do is they will partner with the bigger, right? UNICEF is involved in many of these, but they will try and work on local level and look at cultural context and make sure that the culture is taken care of. And so, for example, I did a study, and this was on child soldiers, right? But also children, right, coming through this trauma and stress and trying to figure out how to get back into community. And the local group that was working on this, they were trying to create a center that resembled their actual villages and places where they'll go back home to, rather than the prescribed international standard type of a rehabilitation center. Because if these children were, spoiled, quote unquote, for 3 months while they're in the center, and they have a bed per person, their own room, and they have electricity and water that runs, and then they have to go back into their village, it's again creating a dissonance. And so sometimes, right, while you could maybe have a person that's equipped for it, you always have to look at the local context. And so that's just something to pay attention to. And I think I noticed this in the movie. A lot of the people that were volunteering, especially there, they were part of the research and they were part of answering questions, are teachers, were local people themselves, Jordanians or Syrian refugees. And some of them said, well, my main, they all get trained, but their main desire is to just really help the children gain back some kind of a functionality and smile, right? I think that was very vividly the most important one, that to make the children be children again. And that's kind of where that therapeutic essence comes in.
Yeah, I think, Liz, that's absolutely correct as far as the involving the local people. I know with the research that was done in Jordan with the refugees, they involved local community groups. Every small town that they were in had a local community center and the local leaders of that community, and they needed buy-in from that community for what they were doing with the research. And they wouldn't do it without that buy-in. And also Mercy Corps did the same thing. And they would partner with local groups in every community, because a lot of the refugees, probably 80% of the refugees, were not in camps, but they were in local Jordanian communities. So that partnership with the community was essential. And also with the different programs that they had developed, they had found long ago that you can develop something with psychologists and experts and educators in Chicago and New York, but those aren't going to work very well in Lebanon or Syria or Jordan. They need to be developed locally with people that are part of the local culture. And also the researchers that were interviewing the mothers and the children were local. They were recent college graduates from Jordan, and their heritage was Syrian, Palestinian, and Jordanian. So there was, again, getting that trust, which is absolutely critical, was far easier. And I could not have done this without them. I could not have gone in and done those interviews. And that's why I chose to actually be a fly on the wall and watch the researchers, these young women researchers, do their interviews. And they were able to be far more impactful than anything I possibly can do, because I would not have any trust. I needed them to help give the trust for us to bring our cameras in.
Interesting. Anyone else? Or I do have some other questions, but I just want to open it up for any other thoughts. Anyone listening, if you wanted to unmute and had a question. And if not, I would love, Trisha, to ask you how Their Story is Our Story is different from other refugee-focused NGOs.
Well, it's pretty basic. We while we have a longer view, I think, with our impact, we don't actually go in and do on the ground, we don't hand out hygiene kits. We don't collect any kind of clothing or medication directly for the refugees. We concentrate on the stories, and the long-term impact of that has to do with a worldwide community that we try and create that, as we've talked about, breaks down barriers, and storytelling is really the most powerful way to do that. I think when you have the lived truth is more powerful really than sometimes facts. Even you can't argue. You can argue with facts, but when you sit down or you listen to or you read a mother's story about losing a child, or having to leave her home and bring her children through danger, and you can't argue with that. It connects you on some instinctual, compassionate level, and it reframes your filter. It expands what you understand, and it reaches out to somebody who you would normally not connect with, and it brings them into your community. And I think for many of us, that's mind expanding, experience expanding, but it's also for our communities, it opens up an opportunity for us to expand, take it from this fear-based, self-centered community that really looks out for itself, and opens up to a place where people are welcome, and where our diversity becomes something that is an asset rather than a negative. And that it becomes this place where you don't just have this much, and if you give it away, if somebody comes in, you won't have enough for everybody. It actually expands what's available. It makes the community bigger and more able to give more, and that's the miracle of it.
Yeah, it's removing the barriers, like we've talked about today. That the story is equally, if not more, helpful for the teller as it is for the receiver. I want to thank everyone for joining us today as we come to a close. We'll still have a couple of minutes, but I do just want to make sure that I ask you to consider supporting these films. Candace, excuse me, has put the links in the chat. If you'll please consider supporting them on public television using those links. I do want to thank you for joining us, and we have about 3 more minutes if anyone had any last thoughts that they wanted to add, but this has been an incredible discussion. I want to thank you all. Ron, thank you so much for your work, and thanks for joining us today. I hope.
I'm very glad to. This has been great, and I really appreciate TSOS's support in getting the word out about my films, because as mentioned, and if anybody watched the films, they heard my little commercial at the beginning, my little pitch, but we're struggling right now to get the underwriting support to cover the costs that PBS stations require us to be able to get it on the air. So that's my goal right now, and I really appreciate TSOS and TSOS's work. You're doing great work, and I obviously think it's critical to the success of refugees, especially coming into our country and other countries, to better understand what their life is like and what it means to be displaced from your own home. And hopefully a little empathy and compassion can be generated through the storytelling.
100%. And Ron, if anyone is interested in helping with that underwriting, is that the link on your website? Where would they find more about that?
I will post it right now, and also on the show and tell site where they signed up for this Zoom session and how they watch the movies. it's all over that. So that's probably the best, is just go to the show and tell site that you use to get into this conversation, and it's got all the information there. But I will post it right now before we sign off.
Wonderful. Any other parting thoughts in the last minute that we're here? Anyone?
If you don't mind, I will say I really enjoyed watching these movies, and I think they're really important. And if anyone has, they're not long, but there's so much information in there. And I think I love the way that the Terran Hope finished with this little a paragraph on how brave refugees are, and that really that they are superhuman. And I think that's what I would want to probably pitch in or end with, this idea that the power of it is in changing the label refugee from being something that is derogatory to being something of, these people are survivors, they're resourceful, they're compassionate, they have strength and resilience to them that we want in our communities. Yeah. So they're not someone to be feared, but someone to actually be embraced. And I just love that message of the films, of both of them. So thank you, Ron.
Oh, you're welcome. I absolutely agree.
Thank you so much. I was just catching something in the chat there. Thank you all for coming, and let's do this again sometime. It was wonderful chatting with you.